Hi class, this is Dr. McGonigal, and today we are going to talk about selection. There are two chapters or parts to selection. So in this chapter we are going over part 1, and in chapter 7 we'll cover part 2. So by now this should look familiar to you. Previously in our last chapter we focused on the right hand side of this, right? So we focused on criteria. We talked about how criteria are measures, conceptualizations, and measures of job performance. And we talked about how we can determine which types of measures of job performance that we want to use and how to measure them. So in this section, we are going to talk about predictors. And the predictors are on the left-hand side here. And these are what we hope will help us identify individuals who will have good job performance. So conceptually, that's what this looks like. And if you remember even way back to chapter 2, when we went over research methods, we talked about predictors and outcomes more generally. And this follows that same pattern. So in IO, we hope to identify these predictors, or what we're going to cover in this chapter in our next chapter, that can help us select the best people for the job in terms of how they are going to perform on that job. In other words, we want to relate these predictors to our criteria. Some examples of predictors include something called biodata, and we'll talk more about this later on. But biodata has to do with information about an individual's background. So that could include, for instance, number of years of experience in a particular job. Another example of a predictor is the personality characteristic of conscientiousness. So conscientiousness ratings. We know from a lot of research that higher levels of conscientiousness are positively related to job performance. So someone who is more conscientious is going to perform better on the job on average than someone who has low levels of conscientiousness. So in terms of what we mean by personnel selection procedures or personnel selection methods, these are referring to a wide range of instruments that organizations can use to predict job performance. For example, these include cognitive ability tests, also known as intelligence tests, personality tests or inventories, integrity tests, job interviews, assessment centers, and simulations. And we will go over each of these and give you some examples in our next video. The notion of high-stakes testing is referring to the fact that when you're using tests in certain contexts and for certain purposes, these are high stakes, what we would call high stakes. For instance, a selection scenario, so using a test to determine who receives a job offer, that's a high stakes scenario. It's high stakes because it can determine whether or not the person gets the job. Another example of high stakes testing is testing for admission to college or admission to graduate school. This is anytime a test has an impact, like the results of a test have an impact on the person's life in some way. Now we will review validity and reliability. It is very important that the predictors a company uses in order to select or hire people actually predict success on the job, in other words, good job performance. This is what we mean when we talk about criterion-related validity. Criterion-related validity, or simply criterion validity, is the degree of relationship found between the predictor and the job performance criterion. This is expressed as a correlation, so you may remember from chapter 2 that a correlation can range from 0 to either +1 or -1. And so both the strength and the direction of a correlation are relevant. So again, 0 is the weakest, +1 and -1 are the strongest, and you can determine the direction by the sign. So for negative correlation, as one variable increases, the other variable decreases. For a positive correlation, both variables increase or decrease together. The way that we can understand criterion validity as a correlation is in terms of the weakness or strength of the correlation value. So positive or negative 0.1 is a weak correlation, positive or negative 0.3 is a moderate correlation, and positive or negative 0.5 is a strong correlation. These are just generalizations and not hard and fast rules, but you can see from looking at this that if you have a correlation that is around 0 or less than 0.1, that is a weak correlation. In other words, that's not giving you much information about how someone's going to perform on the job. We want to use tests with moderate to strong criterion-related validity. In other words, we want to use tests that are valid for predicting job performance. And so why? Why do we care that our tests are valid for predicting job performance? Well, I think one of the most important reasons is that we want to ensure fairness. So when we're hiring people, we want to hire the best people for the job, of course, but we also want to make sure that we're not hiring people on the basis of irrelevant characteristics. So if we stick to predictors that we have validated and we know that they correlate with job performance, then we can use those and avoid using other information that isn't relevant to the job. For instance, gender, race, ethnicity, disability status, sexual orientation, skin color, religion, all of these things are not relevant. We want to focus on things that are relevant, that we know are correlated with job performance. The uniform guidelines inform how tests may be used for selection and what steps are needed for validation. The uniform guidelines strive for equal employment opportunities across race, ethnicity, religion, color, gender, and national origin. If you go to the website that's listed in this slide, you'll see that you have a complete access to the uniform guidelines. And these give, starting with kind of the need for them in terms of what I just mentioned, the purpose, and it goes into great detail about how they define discrimination, what is applicable information, adverse impact, which we will talk more about later on, and standards for validity studies. So we're going to talk about this next, and some of it is a review, but some of it will be new to you. And this can often get complicated, and it might be hard to understand why you need to know it. Well, it's very important as IO psychologists for the reasons that I mentioned. And you can see that, yes, in fact, people actually, and organizations actually do use this. And this website talks about the different types of validity and how to actually conduct those validity studies. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you that criterion validity is very important. And that is absolutely true. However, we cannot infer an accurate predictive relationship if our predictors that we're using are measured in bad ways or crappy ways. You may have heard of the term garbage in and garbage out. That's what I'm referring to here. So we can find a correlation between a predictor and an outcome, but what if that predictor is really not measuring what we think it's measuring? Then the whole thing is kind of garbage, right? So this is why the concepts of reliability and construct validity and content validity become very relevant. And this is a review again, but for some people, the more they hear it, the better. So I'm going to talk about it again. Reliability is referring to whether a measure provides a consistent or stable representation of a construct. So remember when we went over reliability, we talked about reliability over time. We talked about reliability between different raters, so inter-rater reliability. We talked about reliability over different forms or parallel or equivalent forms. And we talked about reliability between different items that make up a measure. That would be your internal consistency reliability. So reliability overall is telling us whether a measure provides that consistent or stable representation of a construct. And one of the examples that I used for talking about reliability was a scale. So if you were to weigh yourself at the beginning of class and weigh yourself at the end of class, you should get a consistent or stable weight as a result, right? That would indicate reliability. If you did not get a consistent weight at the beginning and end of class, then you might wonder whether the scale is measuring things appropriately. The next thing that we'll talk about is construct validity. This refers to whether the actual way that we measure the construct is a valid representation of that conceptual construct. So, for example, if I say that I want to measure the personality characteristic of conscientiousness, is my measure that I'm using actually measuring conscientiousness? That sounds pretty straightforward, like, yeah, we need to make sure this is true, but this is what we mean by construct validity. In terms of content validity, this is referring to whether the test or measure covers the full domain of the conceptual construct. I have used the example of an intelligence test previously. If we have an intelligence test and we want to assess the full conceptual construct of intelligence, then we need to make sure that we are including all the different types of intelligence that are out there. So we can't simply measure verbal intelligence and call it a general test of intelligence, because then we're missing out on quantitative intelligence and other types of intelligence like creative intelligence. So content validity is all about whether the test covers the full domain of that construct. So let's check in with your knowledge of the types of validity. Let's look at A. We have our conceptual predictor of intelligence, and we have our actual measure of our predictor, which is our intelligence test scores. Now, if you were to think about the types of validity that we went over, can you think of which type of validity A is referring to? Now let's look at B. You have your intelligence test scores as your predictor, and you have your job performance criteria as your outcome. So if you're looking at the degree to which your actual predictor, your test scores predict job performance, your criteria, what type of validity is that? So feel free to pause the video if you want to take some time to think about it and refer to previous slides. For A, if you said construct validity, you would be correct. If this was on an exam, I would probably also accept content validity. The idea is that you have your concept here of intelligence, and then you have your test scores of intelligence. And you want to make sure that they are aligned with one another, that your test scores are accurately and fully representing the domain of intelligence. For B, if you said criterion-related validity, you would be correct. This is looking at whether or not your intelligence test scores, your predictor, correlates or relates to or predicts your job performance scores, your criteria. Let's talk more about criterion-related validity. There are two ways to conduct a criterion-related validity study. One is called a concurrent validity study. And this is the more common type of validity study that's done in organizations. This is when an organization gives the tests or the test to current employees and then correlates their test scores with their current job performance scores. In other words, the criterion data. So how would this play out? Well, if you were an IO psychologist and you were called in to do a consulting project and it's a concurrent validity study on a new test, you would get a group of employees together who wanted to volunteer and you would give them that test. Then you would go and get from the company archival data of their job performance scores. So this would probably be from their last performance evaluation or performance appraisal. And then you would compute a correlation between their test scores on your new test and their job performance scores. The second way to conduct a criterion-related validity study is a predictive validity study. And this is when you give a test to a group of applicants. So these are not people who are currently working in the organization. They are applying for a job. At a later time, you then collect criterion data from the applicants that you hired. In other words, you hire some of those applicants, right? And then you get job performance ratings from those applicants that you hired. And in the third step, you'd correlate the test scores that you got from them with their criterion data, with their job performance scores. So predictive validity studies are not as common as concurrent validity studies. Some of the pros and cons. So for concurrent validity studies, these are easier and faster and more convenient. Why? Well, the answer is we can get all the information that we need at one time, right? We can give our test to existing employees who are currently working in the organization, and we can also at the same time get their job performance ratings and just correlate those together. So it's easier and faster than having to go through a whole predictive validation study, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the downside is that it's less realistic because job incumbents or people who are actually working in those jobs are different from job applicants. And this type of concurrent validation study is more susceptible to something called range restriction, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But it refers to the fact that because you have just a limited number of people who have been hired already for the job and are performing in the job, you don't have the full range necessarily of job performance. You have people who are performing well, and you also have people who have would probably achieve a certain level on the predictor. In terms of a predictive validation study, this is more realistic because it uses the actual population that you want to use a test on. So in other words, the job applicants who are applying for the job. And a predictive validation study is less susceptible to range restriction because you are getting the full scope of applicants who are applying for the job. However, predictive validation studies are much less convenient because you have to wait a long time from the time you give all of the applicants the test that you want to use until it's time to actually assess their performance and get those performance ratings. So remember how we talked about in last chapter that performance changes over time, and it wouldn't be necessarily a good thing to assess people's performance the first week on the job, right? So we want to wait a period of time, maybe 6 months or a year, until they are in the job, and then we can assess their performance. So this is what I mean by range restriction. If you're familiar with correlation, you've probably seen something like this before, where you have your x-axis and your y-axis, and you could imagine that within this circle there are dots scattered around that represent a person's score on the test and their score on the job performance rating. So this illustrates a positive correlation. If you could imagine dots inside the circle, and the circle is kind of illustrating the range of dots that are here. So you can see generally as test scores increase, job performance increases as well. So you go up in your test scores and you go up in your job performance. You see this positive slope to the right. And this is what you would achieve in your correlation values if you had a full range of test scores and a full range of job performance. However, when you're actually doing a validation test, you likely don't have very low performers, right? Especially if it's people who are currently working in your organization. Because if they were performing really low, then they would probably be fired, right? And also, if they're performing very low on your hiring test, they're probably not going to get hired for the job, right? So slide 11 just shows you what it looks like when you have actual data, typically from a validation study. So you're not getting the low end of test scores and you're not getting the low end of job performance. You're just getting this higher end. So this can statistically serve to give you a weaker correlation than you would attain if you were able to get this full range of scores. Okay. In terms of different types of selection procedure formats, you can have, for instance, paper and pencil tests, and these are administered to applicants on paper, and their responses are made using pencil so that they may be scored easily, like bubble sheets. These are becoming less and less common, and you may see fewer of these over time, but they still do exist. You also have online tests, and these are tests administered over the internet or at an individual computer or kiosk. Unproctored internet testing is referring to testing that is administered online and unsupervised. So that word proctored means supervised. So that means anyone could take the test from any location and there's no one watching them take the test. Computerized adaptive testing, or CAT, is a type of online test that is automated and the difficulty is calibrated. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'll give you an example. The GRE is the Graduate Record Examination, and this is a test that individuals take to apply to graduate school. And on the GRE, it's a computerized adaptive test. So the first question or the first two questions that are presented to the test taker are of medium difficulty. And if the test taker gets them correct, then the test will go on to give them more difficult questions, and also those more difficult questions are worth more points. However, if the person gets the first few wrong, then they will get easier questions, and those easier questions are worth fewer points. This is what we mean by calibration. So computerized adaptive testing allows for a more accurate understanding of someone's actual level because they're not constrained by the difficulty of the items on the test. In other words, if they know more stuff, they get more difficult questions and they can achieve more. If you know less, then you get easier questions. And so, I think that this can be difficult for people who have testing anxiety. But it is seen as a way by test takers to get what they consider to be a more accurate understanding of actual levels of knowledge or performance. In terms of selection procedures, you can have individual administration versus group administration, so how many people are taking the test at once. You have speed tests versus power tests. In speed tests, you are given a very limited amount of time to complete it versus power tests, and cognitive versus non-cognitive tests. And your chapter has a lot more information on those different types of formats. What I want to convey to you on slide 13 is methods versus constructs. So when we talk about selection procedures or methods, we are talking about, for instance, interviews or tests or assessment centers. When we are talking about constructs, this is slightly different, and we're talking about things like cognitive ability or conscientiousness or integrity. So this graphic illustrates what I mean by these two being different. So you have two different companies, Company A and Company B. They both do retail sales. They both use a selection procedure that is an interview for job applicants. So that's their procedure. They do interviews. However, what they're trying to get at in their interviews is different. Okay, so the KSAO, or the knowledge, skill, ability, or other characteristic that they're trying to get at in Company A is job knowledge. However, the KSAO that they're trying to get at in Company B is interpersonal skills. So even though they're using the same method, they are trying to get at different actual constructs. Okay, and so they're probably asking different types of questions in their interview. In terms of selection procedures, there are some important considerations, and these will come up as themes throughout the slides in this lecture and your future lectures on selection. The first is validity, and we talked through that in detail already, but we will come back to it throughout. And again, this means for criterion-related validity, can it actually determine who will do well on the job? And that is, of course, very important. In terms of another consideration, we have utility. Utility is the cost-benefit ratio of the selection procedure. So when determining utility, a company will look at the costs of a selection tool or any other downsides of it, and also its potential or actual benefit in terms of how much does it provide the company with better employees, better fits for the job. And of course, fairness. So when we're talking about fairness, we can think first of all about face validity. Face validity is referring to, does the test or the measure or the predictor appear to be related to the job? So there's no statistical test for face validity. It has to do with how the applicant sees the actual question that's in front of them or the test itself. Does it appear to be fair? Does it appear to be related to the job? And this is very important for reasons we'll talk about later. Adverse impact is when the use of a selection procedure results in a disproportionate exclusion of minority job candidates. And this is another very important fairness component when we're thinking about selection procedures. And we want to avoid adverse impact whenever we can. And we will talk about adverse impact in more detail coming up.